Bio 102 Endocrine Systems. Good morning, students. Today we're going to look at how cells communicate and how they exert control on the entire body. These are really cool systems. Cells communicate through chemical signals. Single-celled organisms like yeast and bacteria also communicate with each other to aid in feeding, coordination. The examples would be bioluminescence, quorum sensing. So every cell, every living organism does communicate with either its own self or with neighbors, and they have chemical molecules that will actually do this for them. So they send out chemical signals, and sometimes when we look at very pretty pictures of the ocean at night and we see all this luminescent mat of bacteria floating on the surface of the ocean, that comes from bacteria calling each other and then lighting up. Bacteria also call each other when they find food in the big ocean, and they say, hey, come on over. So that's known as quorum sensing. Please do go to this link, check it out, click on it. I'm so sorry, this software does not allow me to click on it. Otherwise I would watch it with you because it is fun. Do look at it and then come back to me. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. In multicellular organisms, cells send and receive chemical messages constantly to coordinate the actions of distant organs, tissues, and cells. Cells can receive a message, transfer the information across the plasma membrane, and then produce changes within the cell in response to that message. Because cells are usually in an environment of a multicellular organism, then the chemicals that are sent between, or signals or talking that the cells do between each other has to be all very much coordinated. Multicellularity requires coordinated interaction of all the types of cells that make up the body. Cells communicate with each other by chemical signals. Three kinds of chemical signaling can be distinguished. Generally, it's three big categories: autocrine signaling, paracrine signaling, and endocrine signaling. And these are classified by the distances involved between the cells. So how far does that chemical molecule have to travel determines if it's going to be considered autocrine, paracrine, or endocrine signaling. Please do click on this link. It will be a preview of what is coming up, and I wish I could go with you on this link, but again, the software does not allow me to, so please enjoy the link and come back to me. Well, here are the forms of chemical signaling that I just talked about. So we can have autocrine signaling, where a cell is talking to itself. So it will target itself. There can be signaling not to itself, but right next door to the cell that is jammed up right next door to it through gap junctions. And so it'll send a signal from one cell to the next. So it's like knocking on your neighbor's door and asking for a cup of sugar. Then there is paracrine signaling, where the cell is not joined to that other cell that it's signaling, but it's close by. It could be a few of them, it could be one of them, but it's close by. And then there's endocrine signaling, where the cell will send a signal, and the target cell can be anywhere in the body. And only that target cell will listen to that signal, and the rest of the body cells will simply ignore that signal. So let's look at all these one by one. Autocrine system. So the autocrine system of signaling, first of all, what does autocrine mean? Auto means self. So then the cell signals itself by a chemical that it synthesizes itself and then responds to. It's sort of like writing yourself a sticky note. You know, when you write yourself a sticky note, you remind yourself, I have to do this. You look at the sticky note and then you do it. So same over here. The cell will signal itself. In this case, it's not a sticky note, but it's a chemical. and then it responds to it. Autocrine signaling can occur solely within the cytoplasm of the cell, like the MAP kinase signaling cascade, which has been well conserved in evolution from yeast to mammals. It's a very old signaling cascade. It's a chain of proteins in the cell that communicates a signal from a receptor on the surface of the cell to the DNA in the nucleus of that cell. Or autocrine signaling can occur by a secreted chemical interacting with receptors on the surface of the same cell. So you could send a signal to yourself inside your cell, or you could send a signal and put it outside on your membrane. But either way, it's called autocrine signaling. An example of autocrine signaling. So when we looked at the immune system recently, we did talk about T and B cells, and we talked about how T cells mature. Well, when a T cell is induced to mature by binding to a major histocompatibility complex, its low affinity interleukin-2 receptors are replaced by high affinity interleukin-2 receptors. We did discuss how the T cell, once it's bound in this major histocompatibility complex, something happens, and then the helper cells show up and all that stuff. Well, one of the things that happens is that it changes its receptor from low affinity to high affinity. And then the T cell then releases the interleukin-2, which binds to its own new interleukin-2 receptors, which causes self-stimulation, resulting in the monoclonal T cell population. So it makes more and more and more copies of itself. This is how it does it. And we did talk about how the T cell suddenly decides, this is a bad guy, and let me make more copies of myself so I can deal with this bad guy. And that's how it really happens. It's autocrine signaling. These new T cells then go on to perform functions such as macrophage activation, B cell activation, and cell-mediated toxicity. So that monoclonal T cell population will then divide up and do various things, as we saw in the immune system video. We can also have direct signaling across gap junctions of two cells, and these would be cells that are joined directly to each other. They're jammed up against each other, and there is a special area called a gap junction. A gap junction is a specialized intercellular connection between a multitude of animal cell types, and almost every cell of the body has it. A gap junction directly connects the cytoplasm of two cells, allowing various molecules and ions to pass freely between them. Then we have the paracrine system of signaling. Paracrine signaling is cell-to-cell signaling over very short distances. So it's not the cell next door, but it's the cells close by. So sort of think of yourself in a neighborhood, so all those houses on your street, those would be close by. Your next door neighbor would be gap junction or the equivalent, but your neighborhood on your street would be the paracrine system for you. Chemical signals diffuse into the extracellular area and interact with receptors on nearby cells. Paracrine signaling, where is it used? It's involved in responses to allergens. So when you get an allergic reaction, that's paracrine signaling. Tissue repair, the formation of scar tissue, blood pressure regulation, and blood clotting. So all of these very important functions are carried on by the paracrine system because this is short distance signaling. There are local regulators in paracrine signaling, such as prostaglandins, which are modified fatty acids. Others are polypeptides, and still others are gases. Nitric oxide is a gas that functions in the body as both as a local regulator as well as a neurotransmitter. And we're going to look at nitric oxide much later when we talk about neurotransmitters toward the end of this lecture. When the level of oxygen in the blood falls, nitric oxide activates an enzyme that results in vasodilation. Vasodilation means making the diameter of the blood vessels bigger. So that increases blood flow to the tissues. endocrine system, which is the third system we're going to talk about of signaling by chemicals, this is long-distance signaling. Special chemical signals are secreted into extracellular fluids by endocrine cells to reach their targets via the bloodstream. So this is very long distance. There may be an organ that produces this particular potent hormone, and the target may be somewhere far away, and thus the chemical is carried by the bloodstream to its target. Endocrine signaling maintains homeostasis. It mediates responses to stimuli, and it regulates growth and development. So it's a very, very important part of control and regulation so that the entire organism can work harmoniously with all its organs and tissues. Again, please check this link. It's a really cool one. I'm so sorry that the software does not allow me to watch it with you. Check it out and please come back to me. So we're talking about the endocrine system. So these are chemicals which are secreted into the blood and carried to the target cells. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see all the endocrine glands that are actually secreting all these chemicals. Some chemicals simply circulate dissolved in the blood. Steroids are usually bound to plasma proteins because steroids, as you remember, are hydrocarbons, and they have hydrophobic bonds, so they're nonpolar. They don't like to mix in water, and blood is mostly water. So they cannot be carried around in the blood unless a plasma protein. Plasma proteins are usually negatively charged, and they will escort them. So here is a summary slide of showing you what is going on. You can have endocrine signaling. Let's start from the right-hand side. There is a particular cell in a particular endocrine gland which will produce a particular hormone, which is depicted in green, which will go into the blood circulation and enter the target cell, and then the desired effect will happen. You could have paracrine signaling, which is in the center. And here you have a signaling cell, and it's targeting neighboring cells which are close by but not jammed up to it. Or you could also have neural signaling, and we're going to look at that at the very end of the lecture, where you have actually a neuron, not a gland, but an actual neuron, which will then transmit chemical signals to other neurons which are next to it, and that is called neural signaling. Let's look at the hormones. What are they? Hormones, so these are a class of regulatory biochemicals produced in all multicellular organisms by glands, transported by the circulatory system to a distant target organ to coordinate its physiology and behavior. Hormones serve as a major form of communication between different organs and tissues. Only a small amount of hormone is required to alter cell metabolism. So hormones are very, very potent. When a hormone binds to the receptor protein, it results in the activation of a signal transduction mechanism. This ultimately leads to cell-type specific genomic responses that cause the hormone to activate genes that regulate protein synthesis, as in upregulation, which is synthesis of a receptor for that hormone. So this goes on all the time. There are 6 stages of hormonal response. So the first thing that has to happen is we have to synthesize the hormone. So there's biosynthesis of a hormone in a tissue. Second thing that has to happen after you've synthesized it, you have to store it or secrete it. Once it's secreted, it has to be transported to the target cell, and then after that the target cell has to recognize it. So there's recognition of the hormone by an associated cell membrane or intracellular receptor protein. Once that's recognized, then that signal is relayed and amplified. So relay and amplification of the received hormonal signal via a signal transduction process, which leads to a cellular response. And then finally, and most important, you have to degrade the hormone, because these are very potent little molecules, and you don't want them hanging around once you've achieved the purpose. There are three chemical classes of hormones. There are three general chemical classes. Most of the body's hormones are peptide hormones, so these would, by their name, be proteins. And then the rest are steroid hormones, which are, by their name, fats. And then we have some very special ones called amines, and we're going to look at all three one by one. Peptide hormones. These are chains of amino acids, which can be small, they can be long, or they can be complex. Small peptide hormones like thyrotropin releasing hormone and vasopressin, these are very small. Usually they're a few amino acids long. Then we have peptides composed of hundreds of amino acids, which would be much bigger molecules. These are proteins like insulin and growth hormone. And then we have more complex protein hormones called glycoprotein hormones, which have, by their name, glyco means carbohydrate, so they have carbohydrate side chains like luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone. Steroid hormones are made out of lipids, and they all have a 3 6 rings and 1 5-ring backbone of cholesterol, and they're all non-polar compounds. So let's look at the steroid skeleton. So here's 1 6-ring, 2 6-ring, 3 6-ring, and then the fifth is, and the fourth ring is actually a 5-ring backbone, and that makes a steroid skeleton, and it's all hydrocarbon, so it would be non-polar. And then just from this skeleton, we can, by changing one bond or another, or changing or adding or deleting one substitute group, you can build different things like cholesterol, as it's shown before. Suddenly cholesterol has a double bond over here and a methyl group over here, which was absent in the steroid skeleton. And then over here we have a methyl group and then a nice big old side chain, which will make it cholesterol instead of the skeleton. Steroid hormones like testosterone are produced by the gonads, and cortisol is produced by the adrenal cortex. So these are all steroid hormones. And finally, amines. The last group is amines, which are made from only one amino acid called tyrosine. So this is tyrosine. And this is the amino acid tyrosine, and we saw this when we were looking at amino acids way back. Amines sometimes can be fat soluble, but sometimes they can be water soluble. When they're fat soluble, they are the thyroid hormones, and there are two thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. When they're water soluble, and they're proteins like catecholamines, which are epinephrine and norepinephrine, and these are responsible for our fight or flight responses. So they're very important compounds. They're called amines, and they're all derived from one amino acid, which is called tyrosine. So again, if they're derived from it, there's substitutions from this generic backbone. So let's look at the pictures that are prettier. We have hormones that are water soluble, which would be polypeptides. They're hydrophilic. We have hormones that are hydrophobic, so they're not water soluble. They're lipid soluble, so those would be steroids like cortisol. And then we have amines, and these would be thyroxine, which would be not soluble in water, and epinephrine, which is soluble in water. And notice that the color is blue for these two, which shows you that they are soluble in water. So let's look at the cellular response pathways. Water-soluble hormones are secreted by exocytosis. So that's pinching off of the cell membrane, and they are dropped into the bloodstream. They travel freely in the bloodstream and bind to cell surface receptors of the target cell. Lipid-soluble hormones diffuse across cell membranes. They simply diffuse across. They don't need to be secreted by exocytosis. They travel in the bloodstream bound to transport proteins because, again, they're hydrophobic, so they cannot really go anywhere unless they have a charge. And they diffuse through the membrane of the target cells, and they bind to the receptors in the cytoplasm or the nucleus of the target cell. So here is a difference. So the protein hormones will bind to the cell surface receptors, whereas the steroid hormones actually will just move right in, they diffuse right in the membrane, and then go to the receptors that are inside the cell and do their job, whatever it is. Here is a picture that shows you this, a water-soluble hormone, and here is the secretory cell, and it makes the hormone, which is depicted in 3 orange raindrops. It's put in a vesicle. The vesicle will then, of course, join up with the plasma membrane, and the water-soluble hormone will be released in the interstitial fluid, which will go into the blood vessel, and the blood vessel will carry it to the target cell. And then at the target cell, it's a target cell because it has a receptor protein, and so this particular hormone will fit right into that receptor protein, and that starts this response, which will ultimately change the gene to express itself, or it will actually, if it doesn't have to go all the way into the nucleus, it might just have a cytoplasmic response. So that's water-soluble hormones. Let's look at the lipid-soluble hormones and notice that they don't actually have to go in any sort of vesicle at all. They just diffuse right through because they're lipids, so they can diffuse into the lipid membrane. They're just another fat. And then they go into the interstitial fluid, and then they go into the blood vessel, but they have to be escorted by a transport protein. And they get to the target cell, they leave the escort behind, they move right into the membrane because, again, it's a lipid, so it can move right in, it's soluble, and it'll get to wherever it's supposed to go, if it's a cytoplasmic response or it's a nuclear response, and it'll just work on it and do its job. So the difference in action between the two water-soluble and fat-soluble hormones. Binding of a water-soluble hormone to its receptor initiates a signal transduction pathway, leading to responses in the cytoskeleton, enzyme activation, or a change in gene expression. So responses can be either here, here, or here. The response to a lipid-soluble hormone is usually straight here, which is a change in gene expression. When a steroid hormone binds to its cytosolic receptor, a hormone receptor complex forms that moves into the nucleus. There, the receptor part of the complex acts as a transcriptional regulator of specific target genes. Let's see how protein hormones work, and then we'll look at lipid hormones one more time. The hormone binds to a site on the extracellular portion of the receptor. The receptors are transmembrane proteins that pass through the plasma membrane 7 times, with one tail exposed at the exterior of the cell and the other projecting into the cytoplasm. So, like this. So how many times this is? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So here is outside, this is the plasma membrane, and here is the inside, that's the cytoplasm. Once that happens, then there's the binding of the hormone to the receptor. So here is the hormone that's bound to this receptor. This will activate a G protein, which is down here, and that will be associated with this cytoplasmic tail. This initiates the production of a second messenger. The second messenger initiates a series of intracellular events such as phosphorylation and activation of enzymes, and these enzymatic changes turn on gene transcription. So there's a bunch of steps for the protein hormones to actually get to the gene to work. So here is a picture of this. So here is the same protein hormone, and here is the receptor on the plasma membrane of that target cell. Notice it's going through it 7 times. The hormone binds to the receptor on the outside, and then it initiates a whole sequence of events which will activate the G protein down here, and then that will activate an adenylate cyclase, which will then change ATP into cyclic AMP, and cyclic AMP will actually go into the nucleus, and it will act on the DNA. So that's how a protein hormone works. How steroid hormones work. They're a little bit simpler. Steroid hormones, being hydrophobic, diffuse freely into all cells, but only their target cells contain proteins that serve as receptors of that hormone. The hormone binds to the receptor, and the complex binds to stretches of DNA responsive to that hormone. The hormone DNA complex acts as a transcription factor, turning target genes on or off, like this. So steroid hormones are just going to move on in to the cell, but if there is a receptor, and then it will bind to it, and then this hormone and its receptor just go straight into the DNA and act on it. So it's a whole lot faster to use a steroid hormone. More differences between steroid and protein hormones. So protein hormones are water soluble. Steroid hormones are not. Protein hormones attach to the target cell membrane and initiate a chain of reactions which ultimately reaches the DNA and results in changes to the cell. Steroid hormones act directly on the DNA because they're lipid soluble and can diffuse on in. So let's look at the three parts of hormonal signaling. First, there's the reception. The reception of the signal. You have to receive it, and that is when the hormone binds to the target receptor. Once the signal has been received, then there's transduction. So once the hormone is bound, it in turn will trigger a change in the signal from one form to another, and that's called transduction. And the last part is the response. So the cell will change its behavior and respond appropriately to the signal it just received. So here are the three parts of hormonal signaling. We have the hormone, or the environmental stimulus, binding to the, so this is the cell wall, goes into the cell, binds to the receptor, a whole bunch of things happen, and then and those things are called transduction, and then there's the activation of the cellular response, which is the response. Hormones have to be regulated, even though they regulate us, but we still need to regulate hormones. The rate of hormone biosynthesis and secretion is often regulated by a homeostatic negative feedback control mechanism. This depends on factors that influence the metabolism and excretion of hormones. Negative feedback must be triggered by overproduction of an effect of the hormone, not just higher hormone concentration alone. So it's a little bit complex on how this negative feedback works. So we can regulate hormones in three ways. Hormone secretion can be stimulated or inhibited by, number one, other hormones. So other hormones would be hormones that have the word stimulating or releasing in their name. Or they can be regulated by the concentrations of ions or nutrients in the plasma, as well as binding globulins. Or they can be stimulated or inhibited by neurons or mental activity. Or they can be stimulated or inhibited by environmental changes like light and temperature. So let's look at the feedback regulation. A negative feedback loop inhibits a response by reducing the initial stimulus, thus preventing excessive pathway activity. Positive feedback reinforces a stimulus to produce an even greater response, as we recall. For example, in mammals, oxytocin is a positive feedback response. It causes the release of milk and causing greater suckling by the offspring, which stimulates the release of more oxytocin. There is tight control of hormones since they are so potent. There are three ways the amounts of hormones are tightly controlled. All methods are negative feedback loops. So when one hormone stimulates the production of a second, the second can suppress the production of the first. For example, the hormone called follicle-stimulating hormone. It will stimulate the release of estrogens from the ovarian follicle, but then high levels of estrogen suppress further production of FSH. So one hormone can stimulate the production of a second, and the second will tell the first, stop making more of yourself. That's one way. Another way is an antagonistic pair of hormones. For example, you might have two hormones and they act in tandem. So insulin, for instance, causes the level of blood glucose to drop, but glucagon causes it to rise. So they're always working together in pairs. Insulin and glucagon work together in pairs, and it's called an antagonistic pair because they have the opposite reactions to each other. And the third way is hormone secretion is increased or decreased by the same substance whose level is increased or decreased by that hormone. For instance, if there's a rising level of calcium ions in the blood, that will suppress the production of the parathyroid hormone. But a low level of calcium ions in the blood will stimulate the production of parathyroid hormone. And here is an example, just written up in a pretty picture. So a negative feedback loop, and this is on the left, you'll see a simple endocrine pathway, and it starts out as a stimulus. It will go to the endocrine cell. The endocrine cell is going to produce hormone, which will travel throughout the body. The target cell will receive it. Something will happen, and it will stimulate itself to stop. And the example could be the signal of secretin. So if the pH is low in the duodenum, the S cells are going to get activated. They will produce this hormone called secretin, and secretin is going to travel all over the body, and then it will target the pancreatic cells. And then the response will be to release bicarbonate, which, of course, as you know, is going to increase the pH, and that will get it back to being acidic. Because if the pH is low, then that is already acidic, and usually the pH in the duodenum is much higher. It's more like 6, 7, or 8. Besides autocrine signaling, paracrine signaling, and hormones, we did talk that there are other ways to communicate, and neurons can signal each other as well. There are two ways neurons do this. There can be synaptic signaling or neuroendocrine signaling. Both ways involve special molecules. The difference between the two lies in the distance traveled, again, as in any kind of signaling in hormones. Here is a picture showing you this. So here is the first the top thing that you see is endocrine signaling, where you have a specific gland producing a specific chemical molecule which travels through the blood all the way to the target cells where there's a response. But you could also have paracrine signaling, where one cell is just signaling its neighbors, and we're done with that. And we have autocrine signaling also, where the cell will signal itself either by binding to its cell surface membrane or inside itself. And then we have neurons. So these are specific cells. These are not just any old gland cell. This is a neuron. It can do synaptic signaling by producing chemicals in its foot right here in the synapse. So if a neuron is attached to a cell, it's going to give it a signal, and that's called synaptic signaling. Or it can be neuroendocrine signaling, where the neuron will actually produce the hormone right on top of the capillary, which will then send it to the target cell to get a response. In synaptic signaling, neurons form specialized junctions with target cells called synapses. At synapses, neurons secrete molecules called neurotransmitters that diffuse short distances and bind to receptors on target cells. But in neuroendocrine signaling, specialized neurosecretory cells secrete molecules called neurohormones that travel to target cells via the bloodstream. So again, it's the distance that matters. So how do we coordinate the nervous system and the endocrine system together? Well, there are hormones, believe it or not. Hormones regulate organs of the body, including the brain, and the brain regulates the glands producing hormones. So it's a big feedback loop. The hypothalamus, which is in the brain, receives information from all the nerves, including the brain, and it is the main control center for the endocrine system. The hypothalamus is responsible for signaling seasonal changes to the body, and this affects reproduction cycles. And signals from the hypothalamus travel to the pituitary gland. Let's look at this. So first of all, where is the hypothalamus, which is the boss of the endocrine system? So this is our cerebrum, that's our cerebellum, this is our spinal cord, and this is a section of our brain. It's a vertical section, and what you see is the brain cut in half, and if you cut it in half, well, here is the hypothalamus, deep, deep, deep inside. And attached to the hypothalamus is the pituitary, so let's look at that. The hypothalamus receives information from the nervous system and initiates responses through the endocrine system. Attached to the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, composed of the posterior pituitary and anterior pituitary. So there are two parts to the pituitary gland. The posterior pituitary stores and secretes hormones that are made in the hypothalamus. That makes sense. The anterior pituitary makes and releases hormones under regulation of the hypothalamus. So let's look at the pituitary gland. So again, and this is us with our brain, this is our hypothalamus, and here's the pituitary gland with two parts to it. Okay, if you look at it in this picture, you can see there's a posterior part and there's an anterior part, very, very small. And the hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland, which has two parts, anterior and posterior. Posterior pituitary is really an extension of the hypothalamus. Okay, so as you can see, it just is an extension of it, and it has neurohormones. The anterior pituitary is actually a real endocrine gland, which secretes hormones in response to the hypothalamus. Okay, so let's look at this one more time and a little bit bigger. So this is our brain once more. That's the cerebellum again, and here is the hypothalamus. Here is the pituitary gland with the anterior and posterior parts. And notice there's a pineal gland over here, and here's the spinal cord. So let's look at this blown up. And this is the hypothalamus, and you can see the posterior hypothalamus is sort of an extension of it. Posterior pituitary is just an extension of the hypothalamus, but the anterior pituitary, which is therefore colored in a different color, is an actual gland, and it produces hormones. Here's another picture of it, and you'll see why it looks different. So in the anterior lobe, you can have they're actual hormone-producing cells and blood vessels, whereas in the posterior lobe, there are hormones that it receives from the hypothalamus and just kind of stores them. And what you see are these are the stalks and the fibers leading from the pituitary. The posterior pituitary does two things. It secretes two hormones, ADH and oxytocin. And yes, we looked at ADH in osmoregulation. Oxytocin is primarily a neuromodulator of the mammalian brain, and it's just a peptide of 9 amino acids. So it's a very potent hormone. 9 amino acids with a sulfur bridge, and it has a very highly conserved structure. Oxytocin evokes feelings of contentment, of trust, and of generosity. They have seen when they ask people for donations that it is the oxytocin that makes you feel generous and makes you want to donate. The oxytocin gene is about 500 million years old, much older than us. We're only about 50,000 years old. So this gene has been around for a really long time, and it's present in all vertebrates. In the hypothalamus, oxytocin is made in the magnocellular neurosecretory cells of the supraoptic and paraventricular nuclei, and is stored in herring bodies at the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. It is then released into the blood from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. These axons have collaterals that innervate oxytocin receptors in the nucleus accumbens. Oxytocin is released in large amounts during birth, and it works in a positive feedback loop for both childbirth and for lactation. It promotes bonding, anxiety, social recognition, ethnocentric behavior, and also wound healing. So notice all the different behaviors that it is used in. Social recognition and ethnocentric behavior, where you recognize your group and you stay with it, is responsible, is dictated by oxytocin. And it is also responsible for bonding, when you feel the bond between somebody. It's a good feeling. There's also the feeling of anxiety, which is promoted by oxytocin. Oxytocin and vasopressin are the only known hormones released by the human posterior pituitary to act at a distance. So the posterior pituitary also produces ADH, which we know is vasopressin. It's a mammalian neurohypophyseal hormone. It has two primary functions, which are to retain water in the body and to constrict blood vessels. So it regulates retention of water by increasing water reabsorption in the collecting ducts of the nephron. Remember the aquaporins. It increases water permeability of the distal convoluted tubule by inducing translocation of aquaporin water channels. And it has a very short half-life, between 16 to 24 minutes. So it self-destructs after about half an hour or a quarter of an hour, and then more has to be produced if you still need it. The posterior pituitary, so we're still talking about antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin. This is also a 9-peptide hormone, also with a sulfide bridge, so it is almost the same as oxytocin, but instead of having the same 9 amino acids, it has 7 that are identical, and there are 2 that are different. And just those 2 amino acids make it a completely different hormone. ADH is synthesized in the hypothalamus, and it's stored in vesicles at the posterior pituitary. ADH also increases the arterial blood pressure. It plays a key role in homeostasis, and it has a key role in sexual motivation, in pair bonding, and maternal responses to stress. So here we have a picture of the posterior pituitary hormones, and we're not going to talk about the anterior right now. We're just looking at the hypothalamus here, and you can see these magnocellular cells. We just talked about these. These are the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. They secrete the neurohormone that is collected and saved in the posterior pituitary, and it makes that one 9-peptide hormone, which differs in 2 amino acids. One can becomes a vasopressin, and the other becomes oxytocin, and their targets are different. So now let's look at the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary regulates several physiological processes, including stress, growth, reproduction, and lactation. It contains 5 types of endocrine cells, and they are defined by the hormones it secretes. So there are 5 different types of hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary. The somatotropes produce growth hormone. Prolactins produce prolactin hormone. Gonadotropes produce luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. And the corticotropes produce ACTH, and thyrotropes produce TSH. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 hormones produced by the anterior pituitary by 5 different types of cells. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They're all listed down here. All right, so please remember there are 5 types of cells, but the gonadotropes actually produce 2 different kinds of hormones. Here is a summary slide showing you this. Now this time the posterior pituitary is grayed out, and we're just going to look at the anterior pituitary. And again, there are these nice big old cells, the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. They're sending their hormones into the blood, which goes and gets collected inside the anterior pituitary. And there are these cells, you can see them in the background over here, yes, these tiny little cells. These are the ones that will be stimulated, and they will produce these little diamonds, which are actually the hormones. So the hypothalamus produces these releasing and inhibiting hormones over here, which go act on the cells. So the posterior pituitary produces 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different cells, hormones, and notice that they have different effects. So let's look at the simplest one, which is growth hormone. Its target actually is bones, tissues, liver, and therefore it is responsible for our growth. Whereas we have these other hormones called prolactin and MSH. These are very specific hormones. MSH acts on melanocytes, and that is for darkening of our skin color. And then we have the stress hormone, ACTH, the thyroid hormones, also for stress and for growth. And then we have the gonadotropes that produce hormones for the gonads. So the control of the anterior pituitary by the hypothalamus, how is that done? The hypothalamus exerts control over the anterior pituitary by two types of hormones, and we saw those, the releasing and inhibiting. We saw them as little round circles being secreted, which then change the cells, which then produce the hormones, which we saw as little triangles in the previous slide. The releasing hormones stimulate it to produce one or more specific hormones. The inhibiting hormones induce it to stop producing one or more hormones. So that's the control. The anterior pituitary plays a crucial role in homeostasis. When you have increased levels of TSH, LH, FSH, and ACTH, that will cause hypothermia. LH stimulates the ovulation cycle in females and synthesis of androgen in males. The release of prolactin is essential for breastfeeding. Release of growth hormone, luteinizing hormone, and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, are required for correct human development, including gonadal development. The anterior pituitary and the stress response. Let's talk about that. So it plays a big role in the stress response. Stress induces the release of corticotropin-releasing hormones, or CRH, and vasopressin from the hypothalamus. And these activate the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is ACTH, from the anterior pituitary gland. This will act on the adrenal cortex to produce glucocorticoids such as cortisol. And there is a porcupine, and he looks like he's all stressed out, and every single spine of his is standing up. We don't want to be so stressed out. The response to stress. What is the response to stress? When we increase cortisol under stress conditions, that will cause a bunch of different things. First, there's the metabolic effect. Glucose will be mobilized. Fatty acids will be broken down into glucose. Amino acids will be broken down into glucose. So under stress, we're going to break down a whole bunch of our reserves. Under stress, bone reabsorption will occur, calcium will be mobilized, so our bones start to get a little porous. And under stress, activation of the sympathetic nervous system response will happen, which is fight or flight. Should we run because it's danger, or should we fight? And then response to stress also induces anti-inflammatory effects, and also which means that there is a danger of catching something. If you're not going to have an inflammation, that means the foreign pathogens are not being attacked, which means they're coming on in. So under stress, under stress at that time, we don't really care if the pathogens are in or not. We want to get out of that stress producing situation, so the body will suspend that for the time being. And just like it'll suspend calcium mineralization and our bones start to get porous, just for the time being, so that it can let the organism run away from that situation which is causing stress. And also, stress will inhibit the reproduction and growth, so it will delay growth of the organism, and it will also delay its sexual maturity. The hypothalamus is also responsible for circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms are day and night rhythms. And how this happens is that the light information received by the eyes is transmitted to the pineal gland, which we saw in a previous slide. Diminishing light stimulates the release of melatonin from the pineal gland, which affects the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. Melatonin lowers levels of LH and FSH, which then decrease levels of estrogen and testosterone. And melatonin also affects the production of prolactin. The thyroid gland. Let's look at the thyroid gland, because that also produces its own hormones. The thyroid gland produces thyroid hormone, which increases the metabolic rate. Since this also blocks TSH release from the anterior pituitary and TRH release from the hypothalamus, a negative feedback loop prevents overproduction of the thyroid hormone. So the thyroid hormone is also very potent, and it isn't allowed to make us grow to gigantic sizes, because there is this very firm negative feedback loop which will prevent its overproduction. TSH and TRH will stop that. Thyroid hormone also regulates bioenergetics and digestive and reproductive functions. It maintains the blood pressure, the heart rate, and the muscle tone. And here is an image showing you the regulation of the thyroid hormone secretion. It's a hormone cascade pathway. So let's go step by step through it. Let's say the stimulus, whatever the stimulus is, results in the thyroid hormone level dropping. Well, the sensory neurons will sense that, and they will send this message to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will say, aha, it will secrete TRH into the blood. Okay, and here is TRH being secreted and going into the blood, and then the TRH is actually going to go into the anterior pituitary and say, produce TSH. Well, TSH is going to be produced, and it'll go circulate throughout the body of the person, and it will actually go into the thyroid gland, which is right at your neck, and it will stimulate the thyroid gland, and it will tell the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone, which is T3 and T4. The thyroid hormone is produced, it circulates throughout the body, and then the sensors will sense the levels are fine, and it will tell the hypothalamus stop producing more. So this is how this will work. The thyroid hormone actually is not one hormone, it's a pair of hormones, T3 and T4. T3, its real name is triiodothyronine, has 3 iodine atoms, and T4, which is tetraiodothyronine, has 4 iodine atoms. But the thyroid gland secretes mostly T4. However, T4 cannot be used, so the target cells actually have to convert T4 back to T3 to use. And thyroxine, or the thyroid hormone, is synthesized from tyrosine and iodine. The thyroid gland also produces calcitonin, which is responsible for calcium homeostasis. When the blood calcium level rises above a set point, the thyroid gland releases calcitonin, which causes the blood calcium level to fall. When the blood calcium level falls below a set point, the parathyroid gland, so this is the parathyroid gland, releases PTH, which is the parathyroid hormones, causing the blood calcium level to rise. So this would be one of those antagonistic pairs. Calcium is always bound to serum albumin. Here it is. Here is the feedback loop shown to you. So here is the normal blood sugar level, blood calcium level, about 10 milligrams per 100 ml of blood. If the blood calcium level falls, then that's going to activate the parathyroid glands, and they will release PTH, which is going to stimulate the adrenal glands to pick up some more. The kidneys to pick up more calcium from the excretory filtrate, and it also promotes activation of vitamin D. And PTH will also tell the bones, you need to release some of this calcium. It doesn't matter if you're going to become porous for the moment, but right now we need it. And then obviously the blood calcium level will rise, and because that will rise, it will get back to this level, which will then regulate itself and does not let it rise too much. So the control of blood calcium. So these are two antagonistic hormones which regulate the homeostasis of calcium in the blood of mammals. The parathyroid hormone, which is released by the parathyroid gland, and calcitonin, which is released by the thyroid gland, which we just saw. Parathyroid hormone will increase the level of blood calcium. It releases calcium from the bone, and it stimulates reabsorption of calcium in the kidneys. It also has an indirect effect, stimulating the kidneys to activate vitamin D, which promotes the intestinal uptake of calcium from food. So if there is any calcium in the food that we didn't manage to uptake, and now we will. Calcitonin will decrease the level of blood calcium. It will stimulate calcium deposition in the bones and secretion by the kidneys. So they act in opposite ways. The other concept is of tropic hormones. So sets of hormones from the hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and a target endocrine gland are often organized into a hormone cascade pathway. And we talked about cascade pathways previously, and it sounded so mysterious, but now we're actually going to talk about what is that. The anterior pituitary hormones in these pathways are called tropic hormones. So let's see, what is a tropic hormone? Many hormones act in a chain reaction, and that reaction can be either tropic or non-tropic. Non-tropic hormones are hormones that directly stimulate target cells to induce effects, not other endocrine glands to stimulate release of other hormones. Tropic hormones act on another endocrine gland, and we saw this in the hypothalamus. The difference between tropic and non-tropic hormones? Well, tropic hormones usually act in the beginning of the reaction, stimulating other endocrine glands to release non-tropic hormones, but non-tropic hormones are the ones that act at the end of the chain reaction on other cells that are not endocrine glands. An example, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is a perfect example of this chain reaction. So the reaction begins in the hypothalamus, okay, with the release of CRH, which is corticotropin-releasing hormone. This stimulates the interior pituitary and causes it to release ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, to the adrenal glands. And so notice we have a releasing hormone, which goes to another place to release another hormone, which goes to another gland to do something else. And so in that gland, in the adrenal gland, cortisol is secreted from the adrenal gland, and it goes into the bloodstream where it has widespread effects on organs and tissues. Since cortisol is what is finally reaching other tissues in the body, that is a non-tropic hormone. But CRH and ACTH are tropic hormones because they act on the anterior pituitary gland, adrenal glands, both of which are endocrine glands. Non-tropic hormones. Glucocorticoids are secreted from the adrenal glands, and they are released directly into the blood where they alter blood sugar levels. So glucocorticoids, including hormones such as cortisol and corticosteroids and corticosterone, are involved in the stress response. In chronic stress, glucocorticoids are damaging to memory, so we don't want glucocorticoids around for a long time because under a lot of stress, people start to forget things. But this is a non-tropic hormone, so glucocorticoid would be a non-tropic hormone. Other non-tropic hormones, vasopressin or ADH, secreted from the posterior pituitary, acts on the kidneys to maintain water balance in the body, as we saw. So that's a non-tropic hormone. Estrogen, which is secreted from the ovaries, aids in fetal development as well as development of secondary sexual characteristics in females. So those are non-tropic. Another non-tropic hormone, testosterone, secreted from the testes. Testosterone influences not just the gonadal development, but aggressive behavior, sexual behavior, and masculinization of males. Oxytocin is another non-tropic hormone. It is secreted from the posterior pituitary. It acts on the uterus and mammary glands to produce contractions. And it's also involved in pair bonding and sexual selection behaviors. Tropic hormones are hormones that target other endocrine glands. Most tropic hormones are produced and secreted by the anterior pituitary. So these are two very important things. Okay. And the hypothalamus secretes tropic hormones that target the anterior pituitary, and the thyroid gland secretes thyroxine, which targets the hypothalamus and therefore can be considered a tropic hormone. Let's look at other tropic hormones of the anterior pituitary. TSH, or thyrotropin, stimulates the thyroid gland to make and release thyroid hormone. ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, stimulates the adrenal cortex to release glucocorticoids. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, stimulates the release of steroid hormones in the gonads, which are the ovaries and testes. And here is the negative feedback loop of tropic hormones. So here we have, let's say it's cold, and that's a stimulus. Well, the sensory neuron will sense it. It will send the message to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will produce this TRH. It will send it, notice it is a little red square. It will send it in the blood vessel, which will go to the anterior pituitary. And over there, the anterior pituitary will say, aha, got the message. Fine, I'll secrete TSH. So it'll secrete TSH and it'll put it in the blood, and that will go to the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland will say, got the message, and it will produce thyroid hormone. Which will go into the blood again, and that will go to the target cells, and you will get increased cellular metabolism so that you can start shivering or other things to increase your body temperature. And this is all a negative feedback loop, and it will inhibit right away so that there's no overproduction of this. So let's look at the tropic and non-tropic effects. So which are the hormones that have tropic effects only? So those would be these: FSH, LH, TSH, and ACTH. And the ones, so let's look at them: FSH, LH, TSH, and ACTH. So this part of this branch are tropic. The non-tropic effects, those are prolactin and MSH. Those that have both tropic and non-tropic effects, so that would be just GH, or growth hormone. Hormones from the adrenal medulla. We didn't actually talk about these, but these are interesting because they also, we touched on them, but they're very important. The adrenal glands are associated with the kidneys, so each kidney actually has something sitting on top of it called an adrenal gland. Each adrenal gland actually consists of two glands, the adrenal medulla, which is the inner part, and the adrenal cortex, which is the outer part. The adrenal medulla secretes catecholamines called epinephrine, which is adrenaline. When you say you have an adrenaline rush, that's it. And norepinephrine, which is another catecholamine, and both of these are water soluble. And these are the ones that mediate the fight or flight response. So let's look at this summary slide for the adrenal gland. So here's the kidney, yeah, and on top of it is sitting the adrenal gland, all right? So let's say we're stressed out. There's an exam. Well, the stress message will go to the neuron, and the neuron will say, got it, and it will send impulses to the spinal cord. That will go to the adrenal medulla, so this is inside it, and it will start producing these hormones, and you will get a response. Or you could get the stress simultaneously releasing hormones, which will be in the anterior pituitary going into the blood vessels, and again going into the adrenal cortex, this time not the medulla. So you have the entire adrenal involved in the stress response. So the response, the effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine, they're pretty profound. Glycogen is going to be broken down into glucose, and that's going to increase the blood glucose level. Also, epinephrine and norepinephrine will increase the blood pressure, the breathing rate, the metabolic rate, and it will change blood flow patterns, and that will lead to increased alertness, decreased digestive, excretory, and reproductive system activity. And then the adrenal cortex produces mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids, and these are also responsible for the stress mediation. And the mineralocorticoids will retain sodium ions and water by the kidneys, and they will increase blood volume and blood pressure. Glucocorticoids will actually break down proteins and fats into glucose, which will also increase blood pressure. And there will also be partial suppression of the immune system. So similar stuff, and this is similar to that. So we're doing similar stuff because we're trying to deal with the stress-inducing activity. Hormones from the adrenal medulla. Those are epinephrine and norepinephrine. They trigger the release of glucose and fatty acids in the blood. They increase oxygen delivery to the body cells. They direct blood towards the heart, brain, and skeletal muscles and away from the skin, the digestive system, and kidneys. The adrenal cortex reacts to endocrine signals. It releases a family of steroids called corticosteroids in response to stress. These hormones are triggered by a hormone cascade pathway via the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. Corticosteroids are a class of chemicals that include the steroid hormones that are produced in the adrenal cortex of vertebrates. Corticosteroids are involved in a wide range of physiological processes, including the stress response, the immune response and regulation of inflammation, carbohydrate metabolism, protein catabolism, which is breaking down proteins, blood electrolyte levels, and behavior. There are two types of corticosteroids, glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. Glucocorticoids, such as cortisol, control carbohydrate, fat, and protein metabolism. They're anti-inflammatory and they decrease eosinophil action. So eosinophil action would be the immune response being suppressed. Mineralocorticoids, such as aldosterone, control electrolyte and water levels, mainly by promoting sodium retention in the kidney. And here are the long-term stress response and the adrenal cortex is a summary. So the effects of mineralocorticoids and the effects of glucocorticoids are given. Mineralocorticoids will retain sodium ions and water by the kidneys and increase blood volume and blood pressure. Glucocorticoids are the ones that are going to break down proteins and fat to increase blood glucose, and they will also suppress partially the immune system. So hormones don't generally have one effect, as you have probably gathered by now when I've been mentioning all sorts of diverse things that happen are controlled by one hormone. The same hormone may have different effects on target cells that have different receptors for the hormone or have different signal transduction pathways. So this is awfully cool because you could have one hormone and it can do many, many things. For example, the hormone epinephrine can increase blood flow to major skeletal muscles, but it actually decreases blood flow to the digestive tract. So it does different things, but it's the same hormone. So, and that is because they have different receptors. So what you see on the left in panel A, you see a liver cell, and you see epinephrine being attached to a beta receptor, and you have glycogen deposits, which are then going to no longer be glycogen, and they are going to be mobilized into glucose, and that is going to increase the blood glucose level. The same epinephrine acting on a smooth muscle cell. So let's look at it. It's attaching to a beta receptor of a smooth muscle cell, all right? And same receptor, but here the cell is actually going to relax because the blood vessel is dilating, and it's going to increase blood flow to the skeletal muscle. So that is different. And then the same epinephrine, when it is going to smooth muscle, that's going to be different. In smooth muscle, there's a different receptor actually. It's called an alpha receptor, and it will contract that cell. And the blood vessel will constrict, and it will decrease flow of blood to the intestines. So it's awfully clever, isn't it? Let's look at the evolution of hormone function. Over the course of evolution, the functions of particular hormones have diverged. For example, the thyroid hormone plays a role in metabolism across many lineages, but in frogs, it has taken on a unique function. It stimulates the resorption of the tadpole tail during metamorphosis. So all tadpoles have tails, but frogs do not. So thyroid hormone will actually take those cells back. Prolactin also has a broad range of activities in vertebrates. Melanocyte-stimulating hormone, or MSH, regulates skin color in amphibians, in fish, in reptiles, by controlling the pigment distribution in melanocytes. And as you know, there are chameleons and other animals that will take up the color of their surroundings, and that's controlled by MSH. In mammals, MSH plays roles in hunger and metabolism in addition to coloration. Here is a summary slide showing you all the endocrine glands and all the hormones that we just discussed one by one. And I also put in a link at the bottom of the page. Please do click on the link. I'm so sorry I cannot click on with you. The software doesn't allow me to do that, but click on the link. Enjoy the selection, and then come back to me for the last two slides. So here is the summary of the same picture we just saw in the previous slide. It tells you about all the glands one by one, and the hormones it produces, and what they actually do, what the hormones' functions are. And so pineal gland produces melatonin, and it participates in the regulation of biological rhythms, generally speaking, as well as coloration. The hypothalamus produces posterior pituitary hormones, and they're releasing and inhibitory hormones. The pituitary gland has two parts, anterior and posterior, and all these hormones are produced by the anterior pituitary and just two from the posterior pituitary. And then the thyroid gland produces two hormones, and it also produces calcitonin. So two thyroid hormones, but only one of them is the active form. And the parathyroid hormone raises blood calcium level. And then we have the adrenal glands. We have the adrenal medulla, which produces epinephrine. And then we have the adrenal cortex, which actually produces glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. So epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla. And then we have pancreas. The pancreas produces insulin and glucagon. These are an antagonistic pair. And then we have, if it's a female, we have estrogens and progestins, or if it's a male, then androgens. All right, well, I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you next time.